To introduce our next speaker, John Law, who is going to speak about why we need monsters. John Law was a member of the Suicide Club, a primary member and principal organizer of the Cacophony Society, and co-founder of the Burning Man Festival. He co-authored Tales of the San Francisco Cacophony Society that came out in 2013 and has spoken internationally about the San Francisco counterculture. And fortunately, he's not currently in jail. So with that, take it away.
Thank you very much.
While you set up his computer, there's more seats here, so don't be shy. There's at least 20, 30 seats around. I also want to thank the committee of the Frankenstein at 200 at Stanford. This wouldn't happen without them. Audrey Schaefer, if she were somewhere here, thank you very much. Ah, there she is. It all started with her. It's her fault.
That'd be good, thanks. Good.
So outside we have some flyers about the program, the Frankenstein at 200. Here at Stanford, there's a big conference coming up. Pick up the flyer, the information desk.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Hello there. So first I'd like to thank Piero Scaruffi for having me here and SLAC and the last festival. Very happy to be here. I'm usually in much smaller, dimmer rooms that the tech doesn't work as well in, thanks to John and the tech crew here. Usually what I talk about, I mean, when Piero said the theme was monsters and it was the the anniversary of Frankenstein, that's a wonderful thing, and the technology that's been developed here at Stanford and other places certainly to some degree comes out of that story if you follow the thread back through history. But with that said, I've never really talked about monsters too much. I usually talk about people doing things that they shouldn't do, having fun, and my presentations are usually comprised of things blowing up and naked people. So I had to figure out how to fit that into the theme here, and I thought about it a lot. And like the stuff that I've been involved in, fortunately, very fortunately, over the course of my life and 40 years in San Francisco, 42 years in the San Francisco Bay Area, has been what I believe very, very formative for a lot of things that have happened in our larger culture. And why do people come to San Francisco? Why do people come to the Bay Area? Why is everybody here in Silicon Valley? How did that happen? And it's largely due, I believe, to romance, not so much technology. I think it's because there's a mythology about the Bay Area that resonates and has resonated for a long time. And that's why people want to come here. That's why technologists want to come here. They want to drop acid and get laid, like other people who came here. And they also want to be in a place where they can be around like-minded people, and they can be next to the two great institutions that we have here, Stanford and UC, to work on their projects. So that's not what I've been involved in. I've been involved in pranking and in cultural groups that have gone on in some ways to, I think, change people's lives in a good way. Very fortunate to have been involved in them. So I thought about in our culture, what's a monster anyway? A monster is something that stands against doctrine. A monster is something that you would cast out, that would not go along with the status quo. So who's the first monster? The biggest monster in a Judeo-Christian culture would be Satan, and who was certainly cast out. And I thought, well, how did Satan affect or influence stuff that I've been involved in? Which actually, after thinking about it a little bit, certainly there has been an effect there. The first group I'm going to talk about was a group I joined when I was 18 in 1977, after being in San Francisco for 1 year. A group called the Suicide Club. And the author was certainly influenced by the mythology of Satan and the romanticism of the period before him. Robert Louis Stevenson, a wonderful writer. And he wrote a story about a group of men who decided to put their worldly affairs in order, come together, and live each day as though it were their last. And so we'll be talking about that group in a little bit, Stevenson. And another influence on the stuff that I've been involved in was Romantic literature, French decadent literature, which is absolutely influenced by Satan. These are all topics we could talk about for quite a bit of time, but I'm not going to do that. Huysmans, who was considered a monster by many people in his culture, created literature that resonates to this day in many ways. Alfred Jarry, who was a playwright in Paris in the 1890s, considered a monster at that time, hugely influential on the later Dada movement. And he created a character called Ubu Roy, which has just become president recently. If you know the history at all, that will make sense to you. I'd like to say that I think I'm one of the first people who made that correlation some years ago. And it's true, in our culture, we've gotten to the point where, we have a giant monstrous clown as president. Hey, what are you going to do? So these guys, the Dadaists, of course, they took art, turned it on its head. It was later commoditized because that's what happens with anything that we create. These people were influential in the Suicide Club and later groups. Cacophony Society is a group I'm hoping to touch on a little bit later in the talk. The other things that influenced the Suicide Club were film and a lot of Victorian adventure fiction, pulp movies. We would do events based on things that influenced us. And I like to say that as far as creating virtual realities, the way to keep kids interested in the objective reality, the outside reality, is just to make that reality really interesting. And then they'll put down the computers every once in a while and go run around outside to do something. Communiversity was something that started as part of the university's curriculum for certain universities back in the 60s. And the whole idea was a very radical idea, extremely radical idea now, particularly in Silicon Valley or in New York, of things being free. So what's more monstrous in a culture like ours than for something to be free? People don't even understand it. If something's free, what value does it hold? Communiversity was one of hundreds of free universities that popped up in schools around the country. Back in starting in 64, 65, influenced by the free speech movement. And the idea was, and they're all different, each one was slightly different. Communiversity was the second free school at SF State, and it started in 1970, and you'd have a series of classes that came out in a calendar that was put out 3 times a year. Anyone could do a class. It could be about anything from conversational French to theoretical physics to clown makeup to mime. Yes, they did have mime classes. And the teachers, didn't have to be accredited or anything. It was an adjunct of SF State in that the SF State paid for the student administrators and allowed them to use some of the classrooms on campus to do some of the classes. They were also off campus. But it was basically, more than anything else, a way for people to get together and to have active adventures together and to learn about one another and know one another. And it was free, which is, like I say, even at that time was kind of a radical concept. It was funded by a garage sale, which everyone would donate their used stuff. We'd have a garage sale 3 times a year, and the basic idea was that you could pay anything you wanted for the articles in the garage sale. Another very radical idea. So what would happen is we'd have this giant pile of stuff, some of it pretty cool, some of it largely junk, in somebody's garage, and we'd set up and people would come in. And for every Nimrod who would give you like 50 cents for a stereo, which is a thing that makes music and has speakers, which might cost $50 at that time, which would be similar, would be like what, $500 now. For every idiot who would give you, or rotten person who would give you 50 cents for that, and you say, oh, thank you very much for the 50 cents, there'd be 50 people who would give you $3 or $4 for something that was effectively not worth anything really financially. So that's how we funded our catalog classes. Wow, technology, what do you know? This spawned a group called the Suicide Club, which I joined when I was a tender age of 18. A juvenile delinquent recently run away from home and skipped juvenile probation and was sleeping in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco and panhandling for a while, and then finally got an apartment. And I fell into this group, which was a class at Communiversity. The idea of the Suicide Club was, and this is Gary Warren, who's one of the 4 founders of the group and the primary philosophical core of the group, who was influenced by a lot of the things that I mentioned earlier and many, many more things I'm not going to have time to go over now. A pretty amazing fellow. He was a bookseller. Books are like little things with pages of paper in them and letters on them, and you read them. Anyway, there used to be a big deal in our culture. This is one of the other founders, David Warren, who was when I met him, I was 18. He was 42. And I thought, my God, who is this incredibly ancient person? Because, of course, when you're 18, anybody at that age, might as well be 100 years old. I found out much later he was quite an astonishing character. He would do things like on Friday the 13th, go down to Union Square and challenge people to walk underneath ladders, to smash mirrors, and to do that sort of thing. And he would also go out on Christmas time and dress up as a Salvation Army dude with a cauldron full of money with a sign that said free money. So, wonderful fellow. Suicide Club was known for certain things. Climbing bridges was one of them. I could do a whole presentation on this. I have done long presentations on bridge climbing. But we would explore the urban infrastructure and literally go together in small groups and do things that you probably normally wouldn't do. And it encouraged people who are not climbers and not necessarily like ninja killers or whatever to go do some fairly radical things that were physically not that difficult but extremely frightening, like climbing the bridge. The gal on top is Jean Mashofsky, who's a very formidable woman, climbing a pipe on the Bay Bridge. And so going over this because this group, I'm not just telling stories about some fun group I was in a long time ago. This group created a culture that resonates in so many ways to this day, and there are organizations and things you've heard of that emanated from this group and a few other groups that we'll touch on very briefly in a while. But we created a culture of the idea of free exchange of ideas, camaraderie, and risk-taking, and challenging, most importantly, challenging your fears, because it wasn't just fun. We did a lot of things that were frightening. Climbing a bridge is very frightening to some people. I'm a climber, didn't frighten me. Some of the things that frightened me, this is the only bridge in America with a giant neon sign on top of it, the Ambassador Bridge in Detroit, by the way. The Golden Gate Bridge Dinner, we'd have different events, including a formal dress dinner on the walkway of the Golden Gate Bridge, which became an annual event that we did every year. Group on the deck of the bridge. Food fights. I'm just going to over some of the events. People could come up with any idea for an event that they cared to, and then they put it in our newsletter, and people would vote with their feet, either come on the event or not. So the food fight was something that Pierre did when he was being thrown out of his apartment by a really nasty landlord, and he thought, well, I'll just have a food fight in my apartment before I leave. This is what people look like afterwards. One woman was a burlesque dancer, and she wanted to perform a burlesque show with her friends to an audience of friendly people, not just men with hats in their laps. So Carla Wood, later to be known as Cleo Dubois, who was a SM performance artist, pretty well known now. So she did an event in an abandoned theater, the Follies Theater, which is now the Victoria Theater. Got all of our friends together. We snuck in 100 people and did an event. We did a lot of urban exploring, as I've touched on before. Sewer tours or urban exploring, and we did sewer tours starting in '77. It was the first event that I ever organized with a couple of other people. And then we weren't really big into repeating ourselves. So the next time it was such a fun event, we wanted to do it again. So the next time we did it in formal dress, which adds another element to the atmosphere of the sewer, of course. We only picked very choice sewers, of course. Canoeing under the wharves. These are just some of the events that we would do. Naked cable car adventures. I wanted to get to that because, as I said, challenging your fears was a big part of the club. I've mentioned this before. Climbing didn't frighten me at all because I was a climber. I liked climbing things. I was a kid, pretty spry. But I loved taking people who weren't familiar with that sort of thing. It really opened up their horizons quite a bit. For me, getting naked in public was the most horrifying thing I could think of because I was raised middle class, and that's something that you don't do if you're middle class. So before this event, which was organized by Nancy Prussia, one of the organizers, she's center next to the guy with the striped, which is Gary Warren with the striped suit there. She a bit of an exhibitionist in her own way, and she wanted to do a naked cable car event. Now this is San Francisco in the '70s, and many of the people, I was younger than most people. Many of the people, no big deal, get naked on a cable car. Hey, we'll do that before breakfast. For me, horrifying thing. So I was so worried about it beforehand, and then when we actually did it, early morning, Sunday, and I looked around, and the only people on the street were these little Chinese gals going to their jobs, and they didn't even look at us. And I thought, wow, what's the worst thing that can happen to you if you're naked in public? You get cold, maybe. You might be arrested. It's pretty unlikely. And so it just busted a wire in my head somehow, and this collective, collaborative group allowed me to do that. Other thing we did, because you could do anything in this group. I'm skimming right through it. I mean, we infiltrated weird cults like the Moonies, and we went and had lunch with the American Nazi Party when they were doing rallies around here to try to pretend that we wanted to join them. Just crazy stuff like that people would come up with. This was a billboard that had been a Max Factor billboard, and Gary Warren and Adrian Burke did an event where we altered it to say something. It said, "Warning of pretty face isn't safe in this city, fight back with self-defense, the new moisturizer by Max Factor." And at that time, a big feminist upswell at the time, and people were upset about certain ads that were considered sexist. And so we thought we would change this to, and actually, we were on the rooftop of a building with 26 people, and we had to vote on what to change it to, which was really annoying, but probably the best way to do it. This is another one which is self-explanatory. That billboard is about 36 feet high by 85, 90 feet wide. We had to rappel down to get to the alterations. Now I'm going to show a little video. That was a suicide club. That was just a brief, I mean, I could talk about the suicide club until you all fell asleep, but I'm not going to do that. This is a little video I'm going to show you of the Cacophony Society, which is a group that came later, which grew out of the Suicide Club, started in 1986. This is the group that spawned Burning Man, Fight Club, SantaCon. Sorry about that one. But basically, this is a big, this shows some of the larger scale events that we were involved in. Oops, go back. Okay.
Cacophony Society.
Cacophony Society.
Cacophony Society.
Cacophony Society. Cacophony Society.
Not at all true.
We're going to visit the sewers of Oakland. Now, some people might say that that's a redundant statement.
From a gourmet point of view, this is a choice sewer.
Hopefully I can eat some Taco Bell. Spontaneous. Those amongst you who are not creative.
Yeah, beat the crap out of it! Just think how many poor oppressed souls that lived inside that television set!
And the guy turned on his bullhorn and he says, "Hey, stupid." And I knew he was talking to me.
Defenestration, defined as, quote, the act of throwing something or someone out of the window. Street features a piano, 24 pieces of furniture, and household appliances being defenestrated from a 4-story building.
These pieces of furniture that have taken it upon themselves to rid themselves of the slavery of their human captors.
And we'll be handing out body parts to various folks.
Are you going to eat this animal?
Perhaps later if we run out of other things.
What do we want?
Me!
When do we want it?
Me! Do not believe the lies of the meat eaters. Meat is genocide.
McDonald's will make you fat. They serve Big Macs. They serve quarter pounders. They will put pounds on you.
Santa's coming to town. Santa's already here. What do you think about Santa Claus?
Well, I didn't believe until now.
The biggest game on the North American continent, an Oldsmobile. We'll be moving on to the next century, primordialism, primitivism coming back and all that, so be ready for it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that.
guys aren't bad people.
Okay, so thanks. Everything that you looked at in that video, and this is just scratching the surface, was a collaborative event. And it was something I like to point out, and particularly in regards to a later event that is one of the things probably most of you have heard of, which is Burning Man, which is no guy came out and cast his rib upon the desert and there was a Burning Man. It was a collaborative event for many, many people, most of whom you've never heard of, who were integral to the event coming about. Cacophony Society was a group that, and the Suicide Club before it were groups that encouraged anyone to join, pretty much anyone to join. And there were no rules. I mean, the format of the Suicide Club was such that any event that you organized, you were the complete and total ruler of that specific event. However, you couldn't dictate to anyone else. So you could put your event in the newsletter and people would have to follow your rules on your event. But if somebody didn't like the way you did it, they'd come back and do the same thing with their own rules or do another event. And the format was such that anybody could list an event of whatever type they wanted to. And there were no rules per se. So I want to take a few questions here. I've got a lot more slides, but what I'm going to do is just kind of jump ahead a little bit, show you some images of another group that I've been involved in. It's super important, particularly to this presentation here at Stanford at SLAC, because it's a group called Survival Research Labs, and this group is a very much technologically oriented group, but it also has has had a similar influence, I think, on the larger culture, certainly the culture of the Bay Area. Let's see, view, there we go. And this group is a group of artists. I've worked with them off and on since the early 90s, and I've known the principal artist, Mark Pauline, for many years. He and his group of people created also a bit of a culture which has gone out into the larger world. You may not have heard of this group. If you haven't, you should look them up. They're at srl.org. Survival Research Labs was a collaborative effort between groups of artists and technologists, including people from Stanford and from UC Berkeley, who had come together to create these pretty amazing and very frightening machine shows using all of the current technology that they were able to steal and borrow. And I'd like to show a little video of this group because it's kind of self-explanatory. They're still in existence and do shows on occasion. We just did a show in New York City, and hopefully we'll be getting a bigger show sometime down the road. And the culture that was created by this group, the people who worked on these events, it had a big influence on larger culture. I mean, if you look at Burning Man, every single fire and machine art thing for the first 20 years was completely inspired by Survival Research Labs. It's a very largely unknown fact. And if you look at all the principals who do fire art and machine art at Burning Man, certainly in the first 20 years, 15 years on the desert, all of them apprenticed at Survival Research Labs. So I'm going to show this video. Let's see. And then we'll talk about, see if we have any time left, we'll do some talking. Take some questions. Survival Research Labs. So I wanted to bring them into this talk once again because of the technology connection, but also much more importantly, because of the culture that was created by this group. The whole, the Maker Faire folks, great, wonderful group and spreading a really great idea, which is you should make things with your hands and be physically engaged, particularly for children, engaged in hands-on, construction and use of things that you construct. Was entirely inspired by SRL, and Dale Doherty is a friend of mine who started Maker, absolutely aware of that, and has noted that. So that's, once again, a culture that came out of the San Francisco Bay Area at a time when you could do stuff like this. You couldn't create stuff like the Suicide Club or like SRL in many other places because of the critical mind that you'd have in a place like New York or in Paris or in even LA to that, and the competitive nature of artists in those places. San Francisco Bay Area was a place for collaboration in so many respects. That's why you're all sitting in here and Stanford's doing so well, because you have people who work collaboratively in the sciences. But that was the allure of the Bay Area, and hopefully it'll stay that way on into the future, and people will be able to collaborate to come together to create culture, which is what I was extremely fortunate to be able to be involved in. We're still doing it. I can't talk about the stuff we're doing now because I don't want to go to jail. But with that said, I think we're going to take some questions for a few minutes.
Yeah, we have about 4 minutes left.
4 minutes for questions? Okay, yeah. I can hear you. I don't know if anybody else can.
What were the factors that caused the culture in this area to grow so rapidly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and could it ever happen again?
The factors that caused the culture that I've been discussing to grow in the Bay Area, what were some of the factors, and could it ever happen again? Well, there are several factors. One of them, like I said, is the simple romance of the place. I mean, from the 1890s on, or even from the gold rush really on, San Francisco was considered an incredibly romantic idea to people around the world. And so, and that's something that never changed. And as things, as the American empire kept expanding westward, you could only go so far. You get to San Francisco, you kept going, you drowned. So it used to be you could come here and change, and you could be like whatever criminal somewhere else, come to San Francisco, change your name, and make an empire, or do whatever you want to do something different, change, and that's something that's stayed to this day. I mean, even with something like Burning Man, where people have these silly playa names, I don't mean silly. But that's something that comes from this whole idea of like recreating yourself. So the factors that made it possible here were, one, this is the end of the world for the longest time, literally, geographically.